ecological well-being and human well-being are completely linked, inseparable. The economy is the living earth. So let's look after that economy. That is what provides for us.
Welcome to the Water People podcast. Today we're in conversation with economist and pioneer of the localization movement, Helena Norberg-Hodge. She's a linguist, author, and filmmaker. Helena has been promoting an economics of personal, social, and ecological well-being for more than 30 years. We weren't planning to begin season 2 until July, but the unprecedented impact of current events has us longing to listen and to share more, and to create more opportunities for connective dialogue. So here we are. We're planning to run an abbreviated release schedule until we hit the full swing of production again in July. The Water People podcast wouldn't exist without the generosity of our inaugural sponsors, including the fine folks at Chinook and the creative mind behind Gary McNeil's surfboards. Thanks again for your continued support. Hi, David.
Hello, Lauren.
The world's pretty much exactly the same as when we last released an episode in December, right?
Is that sarcasm?
How are you doing?
Well, it is actually in the ecology. No, it isn't even. That as well has changed radically after the dry, dusty, fiery, smoky summer that we had when we last, I guess, did a recording.
How are you? What have you been up to?
You live with me? So I don't understand the nature of your question. Do you not pay any attention to me at all? No, okay, that's a good, nice, big space. All right, well, I'll tell you what I've been up to. I have been tending our gardens a lot, and given the fact that there's no travel and very little else happening outside of our home space here, I don't even know how many, but a lot of trees that I've planted on this property over the years are doing quite well, but have always needed a bit more attention than I've been given them. And so just, chopping banana trees back and clearing out ginger and galangal and giving things the energy they really deserve and need to thrive has really been filling my days, aside from, of course, being in the water with the family and, helping to raise a 2.5-year-old.
And writing that masterclass on professional social distancing.
What do you mean? Well, for all of the close people in our life, they all know that I'm pretty solitary. So the whole side of it where we're all having to stay away from each other right now is actually not that new for me. So anyway, I don't feel as special anymore because everyone's staying away from each other as well. So that's kind of weird.
Does it make you want to be super social and be the life of the party again?
Well, actually, again, you're hinting that I may have had a time where I was more social. Cool. Well, no, but I am actually reaching out more with the phone and checking in on family and friends and stuff, even to the point where I lost a phone when I was diving the other day and back on the rocks and stuff, and I went out and got another one the next day. Whereas the last time that happened, I didn't get a phone for 7 or 8 years. So definitely the world has changed. And so how about you? How are you feeling with everything that's going on right now?
I've still been vacillating between, the overwhelm of all the information about this virus and how quickly our realities can change, but also so inspired by how rapidly we're able to change our behaviors and adapt a new sense of normalcy. I think it's really interesting to think about and to remember that we're the most adaptable creatures on the planet and we're so capable of change. And right now that's for, a global pandemic, but imagine if we channeled all of this energy into an issue like climate change. I think this is just proving to us that it's totally possible to make huge systemic change, even really, really rapidly.
Is that why you wanted to talk with someone like Helena then?
Exactly. And Helena isn't strictly a water person, though she does abide by her daily dip at her local beach. I felt like her work was really ringing truer than ever for me right now in terms of the possibilities of reimagining a better, more cooperative, community and values-driven version of the economy. She's studied at places like the University of London and MIT, and in 1975, she started working in Ladakh, or Little Tibet, where she became the first outsider to learn language, and she went on to find ways of enabling their culture to meet the modern world without sacrificing social and ecological values. She was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, which is also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, and she was awarded the prestigious Goi Peace Prize in 2012. There's so much to cope with right now with fear and anxiety dominating the airwaves. And so I feel like we just wanted to dive back in by sitting at the feet of one of our personally respected elders, Helena Norberg-Hodge. She brings not only decades of experience to the conversations of economic localization, but also the kind of wisdom and experiential knowledge that makes me feel really comfortable right now. She's witnessed firsthand and studied radical economic and cultural shifts. She's lived through it, and she has some practical tools for coping and deepening connection, and that's really what she sees as the element we're most starving for as a species. She always helps me step back and see the larger macro systems at work, and also the varying time scales that we have the choice to plug into or pull out of, specifically looking at the ways that the pace of our culture has accelerated to one that's basically inhuman. We're working harder, and we own less and less of our own time to spend with our families, with our communities, and really to be in the wild spaces that can help liberate us from the anxiety of trying to keep up with machines. How does her work resonate with you?
Well, Helena's work has always come back to surfing for me, even though, like you said, she isn't a surfer. But the kind of localization that I feel like we can start to develop because of her information and her knowledge and experience fits really well with surfing, because we are embedded in our local ecologies, and we have that kind of twisted, tweaked version of localization, which is localism, and the ism part is not that cool, but there is something in that I think can be developed, and to me it's that thing of sort of pride in place.
Protection,
Yeah,
too.
protection, and that sort of custodial feeling of a location where, like, when you surf a spot all the time, and you have done for most of your life, you know it so intimately, and I feel like really no other community group than surfers know a coastal location as intimately, because we're in it, we're not on it, flying past in boats or anything. We're not looking at it and admiring it from a distance with binoculars or watching migrations from the headlands. We're in it. And I think that's a really big difference. So I'd like to feel that her localization work can be applied to surfers with that custodial feeling, that thing of really protecting these spaces that we love. Does any of that make sense to you?
It does. And I think it also speaks to our essential nature as watery bodies. One of the primary principles of water itself, water molecules, is the principle of cohesion, of sticking together, of stickiness. And right now, I think we're getting the opportunity to feel the lack of being able to stick with our people and meet in person and have physical contact. And we feel the failings of connectivity via our devices as a substitute for real connection.
Yeah.
Helena is just such a wise scholar of these issues and practical ways for helping to develop a deeper sense for localization in action in our everyday lives. The Water People podcast is brought to you by the fine folks at Sanuk. They craft the comfiest footwear around and have been advocates for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades. Thanks, Sanuk, for your support and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com. Thanks also to Gary McNeil Concepts for their support in making the podcast possible. Gary McNeil shapes some of the quirkiest boards around and is constantly innovating with new board materials like hemp and flax to reduce the petrochemical footprint of his boards. Learn more at garymcneilconcepts.com.au. We always begin the podcast with a question, asking our guest about a time or experience after which they were never the same. Do you have such a time or experience that you'd be willing to share?
Well, I do. I mean, it's definitely the arriving in this place called Ladakh, or Little Tibet, and completely, my life has been before Ladakh and after Ladakh. It totally transformed and changed my life, and it changed my worldview. I was seeing virtually everything through different lenses once I had had the experience of living there and being in a world where the feminine, the deep connections to nature, the holistic worldview, the peace, the inner peace that extended to the outer peace. I mean, they were just, it was a type of utopia that completely transformed my life.
Can you set the scene for us and take us a little bit deeper into your own personal experiential understanding of being Ladakh?
Yeah, I also should say that before I went to Ladakh, I thought I had seen a lot of the world. I had traveled quite a lot, and I had learned at that point 6 different languages, and was very interested in understanding the differences between cultures, and that also included some very remote places like San Cristobal de las Casas, where the Zapatista Indians are in Mexico, and so on. But I was asked to go out to this completely unknown part of the world called Ladakh, which is actually Western Tibet, but it belongs politically to India. And I was asked to go out because they knew I could pick up languages quickly, and it was actually a German documentary film team that were going to film these people, and they had been sealed off from the outside world. So in the modern era, the borders had all been closed because it was a part of Tibet that belonged politically to India. And so they felt that it was very important to have someone who could try to pick up a bit of the language, to communicate with the people. And I was going out for what I thought was 6 weeks. I was living in Paris and quite enjoyed it there. I loved nature, but I wasn't an activist. I had been more interested at that point in psychology and the arts and the visual arts. Anyway, on the very first minute I set foot there, I was in love. I was just transfixed by the smile on people's faces and the vitality, the incredible joie de vivre that was so obvious. It was also an incredibly beautiful landscape. It's up high on the Tibetan plateau, and it's basically a high-altitude desert because they only had about 4 inches of rain a year. And however, it did snow on the high peaks, 20,000 foot and higher peaks. So there were these glimmering white glaciers, and then what in some places almost looked like the Sahara, and granite mountains colored, rainbow colored. And then in the desert were these emerald green fields which were fed by glacial meltwater, and unbelievably beautiful architecture as well that just sort of rose out of the ground. It was made of local materials. Everybody knew how to build a house, simple, just basically mud, solar-dried mud bricks, local poplar beams, and it was breathtakingly beautiful. You saw these monasteries, much like the pictures you see of Lhasa in Tibet in the distance. So it was just love at first sight. And then I picked up quite a lot of the language and became more and more drawn in and fascinated. So by the time the film team left, I had decided to stay on to do a thesis on the language. There had been a professor from the University of London out who had been impressed with my linguistic skills and said I could work there at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And then I ended up, partly because I fell ill, and partly because I was so keen to stay longer, I ended up staying in that part of the world for 2 years before I returned to the West. And by that time I was a completely different person. I was just burning with the desire to share what I had learned about the possibility to live in a much, much more peaceful, healthy way, and the wealth that I had discovered, and that many of us don't see if we just travel through quickly and as tourists. But also, unfortunately, today there would be very few people alive who have experienced anything like this, because there were so many changes through the various invasions across the world. I mean, already starting with things like Genghis Khan and so on, but particularly from the West, the Christians, even before the era of slavery and genocide and later colonialism, transformed so most cultures around the world. And so often when we see tradition and we say, oh, how terrible, they treat their women terribly, they do this, they do that, they don't know how to use their resources well. We don't understand that we're looking at something that is not tradition. It's something that has been marginalized and transformed over centuries.
Where did you grow up?
Where did I grow up?
Yes.
I grew up mainly in Sweden. Yeah. Although I had also lived in America, and I had already been fascinated in trying to understand the cultural differences between Sweden and Germany, where I had also lived and studied, and mainly those two, and America. So yeah, I was definitely very Western. I was a Westerner.
And through your time in Ladakh, what changes did you witness?
Well, the biggest and most important changes, I would say, were the change in identity, the change in sense of self, which took me many years actually to understand, because I did end up living in Ladakh for almost half of every year for about 20 years, and then for another 20 years I was there for a good part of the year, probably an average of 3-4 months a year. So, almost 40 years of my life. And many of these things, I would say now, took quite a few years to really recognize consciously. But certainly what emerged, already by the time I wrote my book, Ancient Futures, which was after 16 years there, it was so clear that the primary circle around people was not the nuclear family, but an extended family, and that also included a few people who were not necessarily blood family. So that biggest circle, I saw so clearly how it provided a much, much more secure identity, primarily because that meant that every little baby that was born had about 10 people to hold it, to carry it, to patiently look after it when it might have been ill or crying. Although the truth is that babies almost never cried in Ladakh, which is an indicator in itself. And the reason they didn't was because they didn't have this unnatural, tiny nuclear family unit. That probably is like the most dramatic change I saw, was how people who grew up with that broader circle, that extended family, were so able to be themselves in a genuine, authentic, individual way. They base their identity on this group of people around them, and they never, even as a 5-year-old, ever did they say, oh, why am I not as good at running, or why can't I do this as well? In an intergenerational constellation, it doesn't ever occur to a child that they're not good enough because they can't do exactly what everybody else is doing. So it's easier to explain it when I contrast it with what I saw, what happens through modernity, and it's primarily through economic drivers, that we've ended up raising our children in an industrial way, training them for industrial production and industrial ways of doing things. So it's become a type of factory where we segregate the young into separate age groups. That, accompanied by the nuclear family, becomes a disastrous combination. Now, I do want to add, as I say this, that this message is probably not very well received by many Westerners who are living in nuclear families, who are sending their children to school. But I feel that I have a lot to teach of how we can, by just understanding the limitations of those structures, make efforts to avoid reinforcing some of the disastrous effects of this. But the contrast between growing up, learning how to do things from elders, and the elders could be the 3-year-old helping the 1-year-old to walk. It could be the 80-year-old helping the 1-year-old to walk. But this whole fabric was one where everyone was learning and teaching their whole life, and where everyone felt useful for virtually their whole life. I mean, already as a child, by imitating the elders, they were tending to contribute to quite useful things, like carrying something from one spot to the next, helping to, look after a young animal. As you were 5, 6 years old, you were already helping to look after younger siblings. So you actually grew up learning how to be a multi-talented individual, feeling useful with a whole range of skills. And all of those skills were seen and appreciated by an entire group. And you yourself could see the impact of what you were doing. Mm-hmm. Now, on the other hand, when we isolate our children into this factory situation, let's just imagine, 30 children in a room and just one kindergarten teacher. You've created this terrible experience of a universe of competition, of elbows. Impossible for one child to help the other to walk. Later on, when they're 2 or when they're 3 or 5, they're at the same emotional stage and are not able to be collaborative and really either learning from each other or teaching. So
it really sets the foundation for a competitive view of the world.
Completely competitive view of the world, and one that also now in the dominant narrative is reinforced with this idea that we are greedy and aggressive by nature. So that's, I guess, for me, one of the key messages from Ladakh is how important it is that we look at the structures that encourage peace and cooperation, not just at the idea of how we can incorporate that in our belief system or in our personal meditation. So many Westerners, when they pick up the teachings of really wise traditions like Buddhism, which I'm very impressed by, I see that we're picking up the ideas, but we're not being reminded of the structures, because at the time that those teachings were developed, there was no need to encourage people to live in deep, interconnected, and intergenerational community. There was no need to encourage people to live connected to the natural world, to the plants, to the animals around them, respecting and seeing and valuing at every level the living world around us. There was no need to encourage people to do so, because that was the reality. It is through modernity that we have isolated ourselves further and further from nature and further from one another. And of course, that doesn't mean that all traditional cultures were wonderful and perfect. There were many things about them that we wouldn't want to emulate, but we certainly would want to emulate, from my point of view, that deep connection to place, that deep knowledge and experience of the living world on which we depend for our food, for our clothing, for our shelter, for all basic needs. And equally, to be able to see and know the human beings on which we depend. What's happened through modernity and what's been continuing to happen is that we've been herded into an urban environment. Fundamentally, the whole process has been one of destroying land-based, fisherman-based, local economies and ways of life, and herding people into larger and larger city, urban conglomerates. And this, after the Second World War, with lots of cheap fossil fuels, was reinforced by replacing people on the land and also at sea with more and more machinery and technology, larger and larger monocultures in terms of plants, larger and larger technology-based ships for fishing, etc., and driving people out of the equation, using these fossil fuels, replacing them with technology and scarce minerals and energy. And then as we were herded into an urban high-rise environment, that was all dependent on fossil fuels too, including the cement and the plastic. So the way back is happening, and there's been a countercurrent almost from the very beginning of this industrial society. And I would say right now, with the combination of crises we're facing, that the movement back to those basic fundamentals of deeper community and deeper connection to nature is happening, and it's vital that we do everything to help make that possible.
So your experience in Ladakh was a springboard to your life's work, which has been the localization movement and educating people about the story of the economy. I remember when I was in high school in 12th grade, I took an advanced placement economics class, and the teacher was a white, balding, sweaty, older man, and I found it impossible to pay attention and deeply, deeply boring and irrelevant to my life as a 17-year-old surfing young woman. And what I wish he would have conveyed was the fact that our economic system conveys a story about the world. It communicates our deep values and priorities and the way we think and feel and move through the world. And I'd love for you to explain what our current economic climate tells us about who we are.
Well, I mean, it's crazy, to a great extent today, it doesn't so much talk about who we are, but the entire foundation is the destruction of self-reliance. So from the very beginning, the whole system started with global traders who were able to push people off the land, away from producing a range of things for their own needs, onto giant cotton plantations or into mines or tea plantations. And then in Europe, also through the enclosures, people were pushed away from a way of life where, again, they were producing a range of basically their basic needs, and they were dependent on each other to do so. It was not every person on some acre of land just looking for themselves. They had social institutions which differed across the world, but of interdependence and organization that were very sophisticated, and they were dependent on the resources around them primarily. They were enclosed, pushed off the land into Dickensian London, and along with that came this fundamental principle in economics, which is comparative advantage, which is telling everybody it doesn't make sense at all to produce a range of things. You just focus on what you're good at and produce that for export and then import what you need. And that process has been going on to the extent that even in the 70s, we were critiquing the fact that biscuits were being shipped back and forth within the English countryside, because we were saying, well, really, people could make biscuits around Britain. They don't have to transport it in big lorries and use all that fossil fuel. But this craziness has accelerated now in the modern era to literally having the same foods imported and exported, because if we ate our own food, say, imagine every country produced a range of things for their own people, then there would be no profit for multinationals. But all the time, the logic has been to strengthen the multinationals, including the multinational banks. So now the narrative today is that we must do whatever the market says. What is the market saying about this? What's the market saying? Our governments are bowing down to this idea of the global market being their master, to the extent that they're also signing in black and white in trade treaties, we will not do anything that might diminish your profit-making potential. And they're signing that in black and white to, the giants, the Monsantos, the Coca-Colas, the HSBC Bank, and so on. And saying, yes, if we do anything that might reduce your profit, you can take us to court and sue us. So it's become a total insanity. And the narrative that we get to hear in the public is that the market's health above everything else. So we're seeing now that with the virus also that there's a clear concern about keeping the market healthy, the economy healthy, and nothing like the same degree of interest in keeping people healthy. And so these huge amounts of money that are suddenly appearing are about keeping the economy going. Now, and the narrative that we're told is that we are all so dependent on this market. We're also dependent on what is measured as GDP, this belief that growth supports us and that the market supports us. This is the biggest myth that we need now to expose, and we really need to know the true story, which is that blindly people, everywhere believing that growth is necessary to keep people employed, to keep things as they are. That's part of the dominant narrative now, that people don't want to change. They want to hold on to their job. They've all become so greedy, and they're not willing to sacrifice, to heal the planet and to deal with climate change. But it's all nonsense.
It doesn't seem like that many people are that fulfilled in the way things are right now.
Absolutely not. What's going on is that people are struggling more and more just to stay in place because things are changing very rapidly. And they've been changing, particularly in the last 30 years, towards this situation where governments are more and more and more embedded in and working for wealth profiteering at the global level. So there are more and more billionaires being created all over the world, whereas every government in supporting this global system are actually impoverishing their own citizens. From America to Sweden to Bhutan to China, the average person is having to work harder and harder just to have a roof over their head, to put food on the table, and to transport what have become basic needs. So we're running this sort of rat race where even the CEO of Exxon is battling to stay on top when they merge with Mobil. So this constant process of mega mergers is a consequence of all this. So even at the very top level, at the global level, it makes everyone run scared and faster to stay on top. And down at the bottom, sort of the real bottom is the most invisible players in our economy who are fulfilling the most important function that you possibly can, mothers and farmers, and their lives are becoming harder and harder as they struggle to do things that are completely inhuman. The average mother today the market is telling her that she's got to work as well as have a young child, and the average farmer can't farm in an ecological, healthy way because all the pressures are to produce monoculture and to merge and to become bigger and bigger if you want to survive. And the logic is, and was articulated just the other day by a high-level economist who's an advisor to the Treasury in England, someone named Dr. Tim Learnig, came up with a report for the Treasury to say agriculture only produces 1% of GDP, so let's stop farming. Let's be like Singapore and import our food. Why shouldn't we? They're doing perfectly well, aren't they? Now, he's articulating what is structurally being implemented. And I think that's again why it's so important that we look at the structures, that we understand about scale and about diversity as essential for a turn towards genuine health for the planet and for us. But unfortunately, so many people who are actually promoting these policies are not conscious that this is the logic, that we are going to eliminate all farmers because they don't contribute to GDP. But unconsciously, by adhering to this belief that we've got to keep growing the economy in this direction, and that we're doing that to provide jobs for people, that myth, which is perpetuated, at every level, it's a false story. It's not looking at the truth of what's going on. It's not. We didn't see the books by very highly qualified economists that warned. In America, for instance, a friend of mine who was at Harvard wrote a book called The Overworked American, where she showed how between the 1960s and the 1990s, the average American had to work 1 month more per year just to stay in place. And this is while GDP is going up, while the economy is growing. And the same thing was another economist I worked with in England, Richard Douthwaite. He wrote a book called The Growth Illusion, showing essentially the same thing, but talking about it in terms of buying power, that for the average Brit, they had in effect become poorer and poorer. But a lot of this gets hidden, and what's so badly needed now is economic literacy that actually looks at the economic system rather than teaching myths about how human beings work, how nature functions, which of course doesn't even really enter into economics. The living earth is described as a bunch of resources and as dead, inert material. So I would say that right now what I see is this really hopeful shift around the world where we are clearly transitioning to a kinder, gentler culture, even in the dominant narrative. What we see is people more and more appreciating the natural world, having more and more concern about the treatment of animals, having more and more respect for the feminine and women, and we see it translated into the dominant narrative. But what's now needed is that understanding translates into the economic literacy where we'll be asking, well, if we do want to preserve nature, if we do recognize that healthy water, healthy air, healthy food is what makes us healthy, and we understand that the well-being of the earth and our own well-being are completely linked, what does that mean in terms of the economy? How do we change it? And that's where localization really is essential. Localization as a direction towards rebuilding much more localized structures, but it's not the imposition of any absolute. It's not the imposition of a particular model, which is also what's so wonderful about it, because it's about adapting the economy to the needs of society and the needs of nature. And that means that everywhere in the world, it means adaptation to diversity. And it's just a win-win-win strategy that we see, and have many examples that are demonstrating the truth of this.
And that's why I wanted to sit down and speak to you in this particular moment in time. We're at the start of social distancing and potential public sort of lockdown or quieting in Australia amidst the COVID-19 global pandemic. And we're meeting kind of feels covert almost, because we're really not supposed to be interacting. But I wanted to sit down and have this conversation because in my mind and my heart, the opportunity here is for us to do as you've been suggesting for so many years, which is to localize, to support local growers. And you've been a leader in dreaming up a viable way forward. And so I wanted to get your feelings about how this particular pandemic will open up opportunity for us.
Well, it is already proving itself to reinforce what has started from the grassroots, which is the recognition that the dominant system isn't working. And all across the world, we've been part of helping to build up a local food movement where the reconnection between consumers and farmers is bringing this wonderful results, because the fundamental problem with the global market is that it can only impose monoculture. So as farmers are being pressured by the dominant market, they've been pressured, as I said earlier, to just become bigger and bigger and more monocultural. And growing in monoculture is highly inefficient. It's highly unproductive. And so you need all kinds of chemical inputs and even in organic agriculture on a large scale, you're talking about doing things so unnaturally that you have all kinds of external inputs that are expensive and that you're dependent on. When the distance is shortened between the farm and the market, suddenly the market is pressuring for diversification. The farmer who can shift from just growing some avocados to even also just having some basil or some parsley or some bananas will find that they can earn much, much more. So suddenly the market pressures in the opposite direction. Now, that doesn't only mean that it pressures towards diversity, it's actually a pressure towards increasing the productive use of land. You can get more usable food, not just biomass, but food from a farm that has diversity. Ideally, also animals in the cycle that will provide dung and that will, the most important, useful fertilizer. And again, that's the exact opposite of the farm factory, where this completely unnatural treatment of animals is not the most, it's the most cruel, but it's also the most unhygienic, it's the most toxic way of doing things. Whereas the diversification, and if people haven't heard of or seen this film, The Biggest Little Farm, I highly recommend it, because it demonstrates exactly what we have been able to help facilitate around the world, even from China to South America to Sweden. There is this local food movement growing, and you just have so many inspiring examples of how this more productive way of doing things is actually reducing the ecological footprint.
And it's more pleasurable. It's the more pleasurable decision, better for person, better for the planet.
Yeah.
And it makes more delicious food.
More delicious and much healthier food.
Yeah.
And it creates more space for wildlife. So you actually, even on the farm, have more wildlife and, the thriving ecosystem that we must nurture. Another very important part of this is that in localizing this way, we are actually in need of more people. The dominant path, this growth narrative that we have, is based on systematically removing people, using more and more energy, more and more scarce minerals. They're mining the seabed for the minerals needed for electric cars. And so there's a sort of very high-tech Green New Deal that we need to be very skeptical about. Mm-hmm. There is a real Green New Deal which is happening around the world. We just have to change our lenses, our spectacles, to look out for that. It's more human scale, and that means, smaller, it's slower, but actually more efficient and more productive. So it's turning the dominant narrative on its head, and it's not just a theory. We have so many examples now that show that it works. So now with the virus, I was just speaking to a colleague in Japan last night, and she was saying that, the government there, unfortunately, has gone down the same way, pushing for this import-export-led path where more and more food in Japan was imported, a lot of it from China, and now suddenly those supermarket shelves are empty and people are turning to the local. But they're not just turning to the local for that reason. They're now becoming very concerned about their immunity and realizing that fresh, healthy food without chemicals, not without preservatives, is much better to stay healthy. So this big health signal is leading to that coming together of realizing that healthy food and my own health are completely linked. So there's a big push, and they've been able also to bring in some changes in legislation in 23 prefectures, because the former Minister for Agriculture has become a colleague in our international alliance for localization. He has been, for a long time, as Minister for Agriculture, he already started trying to warn about the trade treaties that were destroying farming. And then he wasn't able to persuade the government, so now he's working at the grassroots and bringing about changes in the law at the local level, which, as that proliferates, is becoming a way of transforming the bigger political sphere. But what's so beautiful about it is, as you were saying, is that as people come together in human scale groups at the local level, they actually find the whole process of bringing about change more enjoyable, more collaborative. And so when we think about changing this whole big economy and this big world, it feels it feels totally impossible. And that's not how change will come. It will come by starting to create those local units and then linking up with one voice, not necessarily linking up into one giant organization or one giant movement, but singing to the hymn sheet of life, diversity, human scale, all go together. And that is a movement that's growing, and for sure this virus, on top of climate change, on top of neo-fascism, which is a complete consequence of neoliberalism, along with people's loss of faith in their national government, along with numerous problems that we're facing, we're seeing this movement growing from the grassroots. And again, what it demonstrates is that when we have that face-to-face experiential knowledge of others, our prejudices are almost without exception falling away. It's when we have the idea of the dark-skinned person or the Muslim or the Chinese, and when we only see them as an invasion of tourists or as an invasion of impoverished immigrants who seem to threaten our jobs, that prejudice and fear grow. But once we are creating interdependent structures, and with localization we're creating an interdependence that actually needs more people on a crowded planet, this is a really important part of the story. By saying that we need more people, I don't mean that we want to increase population further, because clearly overpopulation overall has a greater toll on natural systems. But once we realize that the reason why this humanity of today has so destroyed the planet, and now with climate change, really threatening our survival, why and how has it done so? Because we have been using fossil fuels and chemicals and minerals in a way that is completely unsustainable. And that's all been linked to scale and speed that have created a system that is inhuman, a system that we don't see. Once we start seeing the system that we're supporting, we couldn't even have GDP. It would be impossible if, for instance, here in the Barren Shire, we were going to measure our progress. No way in the world could we use a measure like GDP. In other words, GDP literally goes up when the water is so polluted we have to buy water in bottles. It goes up when we clear cut all the trees. In any local community in the world, no one would be mad enough to use that as a measure of progress.
And it's exactly that, those economic drivers that are unleashing new pathogens like COVID. The destruction of nature is literally making us more ill by way of infectious disease. And that's part of what's happened with coronavirus, is that as I think it's determined that the virus came from bats, as bat habitat was encroached upon more and more by human development, humans and bats had more interaction, and then the virus was able to jump from one species to another. And that's the case with many other infectious diseases. And we've seen them exponentially rise in frequency as we have just destroyed more and more of the living world.
Yeah, and again, there it's what's tricky is to speak with any certitude, going back before the industrial era, but certainly, with the rise of this global, very exploitative system that was already 500 years ago imposing monocultures and disrupting ecosystems, most of these problems have arisen in that period. Before that, apparently there were pandemics, but it would be very, very silly if anyone thought that our manipulation of the natural world is not connected to an increase in pathogens and as you say, imbalances that are threatening our health at every level. This is now a new form, but pesticides have been so clearly linked to cancer, to neurological diseases, to even the deficiency in IQ. Studies in Mexico showed very clearly children who were subjected to the pesticides had a much lower IQ than children who were healthy. So, yeah, we've been part of a system that has been extremely damaging, and now, in response, this virus may help us more even than climate change to make a rapid transition towards localization.
So your work hinges on the idea of trust and community and connection. How do we have this unprecedented opportunity right now to, many of us do, many of the most privileged of us have the opportunity to not be at work right now, to be isolated within our nuclear families, and we have maybe an unprecedented amount of time to be in our own minds and our own hearts. How do we balance this bizarre social isolation time with our deep need and the ecological imperative of building our communities again in deep and resilient ways?
Well, I think first of all, I think even though our nuclear families are so impoverished, because it is so much more difficult to meet the needs of another human being in this sort of bipolar structure, it's made for imbalance. One person is a bit more interested in something and the other person becomes more needy, and it's almost impossible to keep the balance exactly so that both partners feel they're getting what they need. And that again was so clear in the traditional situation, that when you're in the sort of basket of relationships that are sharing the sorrows and the joys and the tasks of life, things become so much easier. So right where we are now, it's one of the things that makes the nuclear family sometimes a hellhole, is that we're like in a pressure cooker from this economic system, because just to survive, the pressures extend. I say just to survive. I mean, first of all, there are literally, the majority of people probably are so pressured to keep running just to keep a roof over their head and the basic needs.
Living paycheck to paycheck. Yeah.
That dramatically increases the pressure on our relationships, obviously. But then I see people too who are stars in one way or another, whether they're writers or actors or musicians, whatever they are, they're very afraid if they take a pause, and disappear for a while, that they're going to disappear forever. There's like this huge psychological pressure to keep going, to be seen, to be seen. So the pressure towards money and fame seems to extend to everybody. Right now, the virus may be one of the big blessing is that right now this virus may be a big blessing by basically allowing people to just pause. The whole world is pausing. The whole world is locking down. Maybe I don't have to run so fast. And maybe if I'm not seen right now, it's not going to matter so much because everybody's in lockdown. And certainly the families who are going from paycheck to paycheck, I think we're going to be seeing the absolute need for community-style support. And we can see it already emerging. I'm seeing it in many places, getting wonderful messages from different parts of the world, how people are coming together to support each other, both in terms of, helping to shop and make sure that no one is isolated, and not looked after. So there's a lot of community building happening. I think, if possible, I would prefer to be locking down in a bigger group. Ideally, I think if 10 neighbors decide to sort of share the care and the situation, it seems much healthier that only one person out of 10 goes out to do the shopping and, potentially get contaminated, if we are in isolation. So I would urge people to try to lock down in groups. And I would urge people to now use the web and the internet to connect. We saw in Italy how people were also connecting through song over greater distance. I hope it's going to be legally possible to gather outdoors in small groups and, keep enough distance, but to share and sing, maybe. I think singing, again, is something I learned from traditional culture. Singing, dancing, making music is fundamental. It's in our DNA. Virtually every culture did that. And it was done in a participatory way, with the old and the young together. Singing, dancing, making music. It's a joy and it's a deep binding.
And biologically medicinal too.
Absolutely.
Whenever you're talking about the amazing hormones released in our bodies.
Yes, absolutely. And just the fact of being able to sing a tone together is this experience of oneness. It's a deeply spiritual experience, which is why virtually every spiritual tradition and religion use song and chanting as part of it. And now also the latest evidence about the vagus nerve is that when we hum and sing, we stimulate the vagus nerve. And that has a benefit throughout our whole body. So there are many, many different fronts. It's a meditation, and it has that hormonal and serotonin effect. So we need to reflect also on the fact that it's a tragedy that as part of this industrial growth-oriented modernity, the majority of Westerners have been silenced when it comes to singing. The majority. People have been made to feel that unless they're really good and can stand on the stage and perform, they shouldn't sing. I cannot believe how many people are so afraid of it that we've been silenced. It's been part of that process of competition and the creation of a commercial spectator and star culture where we haven't been doing things in groups. And again, I keep saying intergenerational. It's a really important part of it, because in that intergenerational group, again, that competitive pressure and that pressure to be perfect or else just keep quiet, it's just not there. And you can even see it in the types of songs and dances and music making that went on all around the world traditionally. So yes, let's bring that back now. the virus should really help us commit to singing together. Some groups now are beginning to do it on the web, singing together. I'm hoping that many of us will also be able to do it outside, and we don't have those narrow alleys that they do in Italy, where in towns they were singing to each other across the balcony. But that's probably one of the most important symbols, and not just symbols, but realities that have come out of the virus. One of the most beautiful, inspiring ones. Another aspect of the traditional culture that was so important was that children were allowed to use their bodies, particularly when they were young, to see them running, at high speed up the mountain and down again, and just seeming to have endless energy, just like unbelievable energy. And to then see with modernity this pressure to put them in school, and they start with age 4, to tell them to sit still the whole day and to just use, the left part of their brain. Again, we need to, to wake up to this. We don't realize how damaging that is, and how that's linked in turn to a type of fear, a fear of not succeeding, because the path that's laid out for us is that children have got to get that really good education, to get that good job in the city, and there are far too many parents still today who are changing their values. They want to see a more collaborative, more ecological way forward, but the fear still, in many cases, means they're pushing their children towards the dominant education direction. And that's a really important area to look at. And again, now the virus, if we are going to be, more in our homes and hopefully supporting each other in community, because a lot of that could even be done on the web, supporting each other in helping our children to, first of all, be able to use their bodies most of the day while they're young. And that means also developing the hand and eye coordination, which now is widely recognized as necessary to develop a healthy brain. So, wait with the reading, wait with the maths, and remember how many hours we spent doing trigonometry and calculus, and never once in my life have I used it, not once. It's just obscene what we're doing.
What I hear is that our modern approach to education basically instills the idea that we should ignore our bodies. We should ignore our bodies and not trust our biological urges. And that continues through our whole lives. I mean, look at how immobile most of our lives are, and how something like sitting in front of a computer screen allows us to completely disconnect from the physical. And right now it's a really more valuable tool than ever to be able to connect through the internet. But at the same time, it's really bringing up for me the deep difference between connectivity and deep connection.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I am worried that the virus could lead to a giant leap forward for the push to create greater dependence on the web, to get more people connected to technology. And I hope people are hearing about the evidence now, the energy intensity of the internet. I mean, we're using huge amounts of energy, and it's not going to be solved with, plastering the Sahara with more solar panels. Those solar panels use very precious minerals. So we need to be looking at how can we reduce our dependence on energy. Yeah, there is a way in which the virus could serve to reinforce the path that is, unfortunately, the dominant forces, our national governments and global corporations, are transmuting into this information financial body that's acting almost like a government, where the Googles and the Amazons and the Wall Street Silicon Valley are working together, and it's now also in the name of climate change means pushing total replacement of people on the farm, so that it'll be robots linked to drones, linked to satellites, and with 5G, the driverless cars, and all of this replacing people at every level and using energy and resources. So that, I think, is what we have to step back and re-examine and really look at. The overall thrust of that is taking us further and further from nature. It's at every step about scaling up and speeding up economic activity and centralizing globally and imposing this global consumer monoculture. So on the other side, we see everywhere this springing up, as I was saying, not just local food, but we've got local business alliances. We even have local finance institutions being set up because people are realizing that they prefer an independent family business. They much prefer to go to a restaurant that's owned by an independent family rather than a giant chain like McDonald's. They love to visit the family farm, and so the smaller scale, the more authentically rooted and diverse is what we love and what we feel connected to, what we're part of. It's life. And so that's all emerging, but until we wake up, the dominant path is continuing to deliver things more cheaply that are mass-produced, that are unnatural, that are toxic. So at every level, whether it's natural medicine versus mass-produced industrial medicine, whether it's building materials, whether it's clothing, and most importantly, food, we have this artificially low price for the corporate product and an artificially high price for the natural and the authentic, which is what we all want. So again, huge need for economic literacy, and I would love to and will try to develop a web-based education program on what I call eco-literacy, because that eco-literacy includes economic literacy linked to ecological literacy. And ecological literacy as a broader body includes what's coming out of the more feminine, holistic approach to life. It includes a path towards a more embodied spirituality. And that, again, it's embodied because it's more holistic, and it's beginning to understand, the information transference from our gut to our brain, and why we now talk about the gut being our brain. It's also beginning to see the connection between the grain, our gut, and our brain. In other words, that deep interconnectedness with the rest of life. So this is growing all the time pointing to that direction that is ecological well-being and human well-being are completely linked, inseparable. The economy is the living earth. So let's look after that economy. That is what provides for us. And what we're adding with the localization movement is that not only is nature the economy, but that economy offers many, many more meaningful, enjoyable livelihoods. Whether you are making herbal remedies, whether you're building, and again, together as a community endeavor, building houses out of local materials. All of these trends are being demonstrated, and many times people will spend thousands of dollars to go on a weekend workshop to enjoy that type of work, which is a gift from nature that we can have, as I say, infinite job opportunities working with the natural world. But it means that we've got to wake up now to the threat of accepting some of the supposedly green solutions. The smart green city, all of that's part of a path taking us away. What we're advocating in our International Alliance for Localization is not at all that there'll be no cities, but we must restore balance between city and country. And that that is for us
They
an
must not
absolute
be
given.
polarized experiences.
No, and there has to be a balance, because right now livelihoods in nature are becoming, basically extinct. So revitalizing that and rebuilding it is what localization is about.
So this is the Water People podcast, and we talk mostly to water people and mostly surfers. And I think surfing has had a really surfing has been such a microcosm of this conversation about the incomparable joys and wellness that nature offers compared to a mechanized experience. And that's been through wave pools. Wave pools have been popping up all over the world because, there's more and more demand for waves, for the actually infinite resource of waves that keep coming no matter what, completely free, as an absolute gift from nature to us. We're so gifted to be able to receive the blessing of waves. But there are these mechanized parks set up for surfing more and more all the time. And they're interesting, they're novelty, they're also very energy and water intensive. They also take a lot of chemicals and lights and some people to run as well. But I think, my feeling is that they will help us understand even more deeply that the experience you have in the ocean is incomparable to anything you could have inside of a machine. Sure, it's a novelty, it's an interesting experience, it is technically perfect, but the experience of surfing is more than experiencing technical perfection. It's about spontaneity and spirituality and deep connection and camaraderie and community. And so my feeling is that those truths will prevail.
Well, I think so. I just hope that people will wake up to that quickly and not, encourage that more of these artificial
Wave
pools are established, because they are water intensive and energy intensive. And I don't surf, but for me, why I love the sea and why I love to see surf is precisely because every single moment, every single wave is unique. That's the richness, that's the joy of life, and that's also the beauty. When we admire the beauty of a tree or a plant, it's the imperfection. No two leaves are ever identical. It's life, that fundamental principle of diversity, that every cell, every bit of this amazing, magical, living Gaia is unique from moment to moment, each and every cell changing as well. So being in tune with that, being in touch with that, so enriches our lives. And that's why also for the child, being able to base their identity on living people around them, one of the most important reasons that's so important is that they are not going to be comparing themselves to an idea of perfection or an image of perfection, but actually to real people who are never perfect, but have their varying, good sides and bad sides, but everybody different and nobody's perfect.
How are you staying positive and hopeful and in this time of pandemic and near lockdown here in Australia? And what ideas do you cycle in your mind when you start to feel overwhelmed?
Well, I do. I actually really value something called EFT, emotional freedom technique, where you just use sort of a method of tapping while you essentially remind yourself of how much happier you feel when you feel grateful for life, and when it's basically a sort of a little trick to turn a negative thought into something positive. And what experts say about this too is that with most, when people have problems, whether it's addiction or anger or depression, that what we all need is to bathe ourselves in a sense of love. in a sense of, it's a sense of deep connection and love for ourselves. And I think that's because in our culture we've all been starved of that, because we've been in this factory farming way of living. We've ended up deprived of that feeling of deep connection and acceptance. But when I think intellectually right now about the virus, then I do sometimes think, oh God, is it going to lead to, for instance, electronic money, which is something that's being pushed on us, which would be, again, a huge step in the wrong direction. Every time there's a transaction using electronic energy is always more sophisticated, more high-powered. We don't need it. First of all, we need to take back the banks into a democratic process where the government issues the money, and then once money has been printed and issued, you're allowed to use it in a much more decentralized way. Our farmers' markets, our small growers, small everything will suffer hugely if we go to electronic money. So that's going to be a centralizing step. But that, for hygiene reasons, could be imposed and encouraged. It's already being pushed massively. So I'm wanting to do everything I can to get a message out about the need for greater clarity, that something that looks like a tiny step and insignificant, and for instance a very small lightweight technology like our mobile phone, that these are actually part of a system. And that if we really step back and look at which systemic direction we want to support, we're going to want to say no to further going down that path. That doesn't mean that the way to do it is to throw our mobile phone out or to never use a credit card, but it means coming together with greater clarity about the direction, the systemic direction of the techno-economic system, and it is always techno-economic. That is the most important issue today. Whether you're talking about the virus, whether you're talking about climate, whether you're talking about pesticides, whether you're talking about cancer, whatever issue you're concerned with, the choice between those two systemic directions and how we can support the one that takes us back to the life of farming, coming closer to nature, closer to place, closer to human community. And that also, I want to say that intellectually, it's completely linked to choosing a more holistic approach as opposed to a narrow, specialized approach. So the more holistic approach is in turn linked to supporting smaller scale systems where we get feedback loops, so that we inevitably become both more humble and more intelligent when we live in a way where we see our impact on other people and on the living world. We are humbled by the complexity of what we're dealing with, and through the humility, we'll be taking more careful steps. And the humility, in turn, is reinforced by the fact that you're able to perceive the wholeness of things, the interconnectedness of things. And you're forced to use more of your right brain as well. And as you also use more of your right brain, you're also using more of your body. The experiential knowledge becomes more fundamental in shaping what we think and what we do. The other path of over-specialization, where we've been trained, now from the age of 4, to abuse our left brain until almost deforming our brain and becoming so disconnected from our own body, literally from our own body, and of course from our own heart. That path is what's killing us, and that in turn is linked to this larger scale techno system. So when I feel concerned about the way we're going, I remind myself of the everyday messages I'm getting that so clearly show that the vast majority of people want something else. That people who voted for Trump or for Bolsonaro in Brazil are doing so out of fear. They're not doing it because they want a world so disconnected from community and nature. They fear, they believe they have no choice, but there is a choice. There is a choice, to embrace this other path. And as I say, it's not just an idea, it's not just some kind of philosophy, it is actually emerging. And once we get more connected to that, we'll see more evidence every day. I feel, my inbox every day does have roughly as many good things as it does bad things, because I'm so connected to that grassroots movement globally.
For people for whom your message is resonating deeply about moving back to a more human-paced, human-scaled, more deeply connected to self and community and planet kind of world, how do we begin?
Well, I think I like to leave people with 5 words. That's for right now anyway. We've worked out, connect, educate, resist, renew, and celebrate. So the first word, connect, is that we want to encourage everyone to seek out a few like-minded people, anything from 3 to maybe 20, but sort of a human scale group.
Fewer than 10 in the US right now, that's what's recommended.
Okay, maybe fewer than 10. But so, seek them out, because the sort of flag you would wave is, are you interested in just stepping back, breathing a little bit, and then looking at how can I improve my own life and the state of the planet? What can we do? That we want people to ask that question in a group, because the minute you connect, you're already starting to take a step, a deeply healing step. That is also the foundation of almost all the successful therapies, from Alcoholics Anonymous to, working with prisoners and delinquents and so on. This being part, feeling belonging, feeling part of a group is fundamental. We all so desperately seek approval and love from others, and to be on the same difficult journey together is fundamental. Then when we say educate, part of what we're offering in Local Futures is big picture material that help us see how something that might look very benign and helpful to the planet is actually reinforcing the dominant system. So, for instance, just recycling plastic without any notion of how we're actually going to be reducing the production of it is not something that we want to encourage. It's all of those single issue things can be fine, but we want people to link that to a bigger picture that will then help to reduce the problem in the first place systemically. So, and so in the education process, again, we want to have that as a we together process. And then part of what we feel is important is to understand these 2 distinct directions, and being willing to resist as well as renew means not being afraid of saying no. So, for instance, when there is a new development in your neighborhood that is clearly going to be bringing in more tourists or more pollution, then don't let the dominant narrative prevent you from protecting that. All around the world, the big developers and the corporate entities are accusing any group that tries to protect its community or land of being NIMBYs. And actually what we need is for people all over the world to have the right to protect their community and their land, and to be part of a movement that supports the right for everyone to do that. And that's also, for instance, why it's so important that we, and particularly in my organization, we do that, but that we see localization as a global gift, not just something we want to do in our backyard. We want to see every community have the right to fresh, healthy food as a human right. And we want to bring about a world where that's possible for everybody. So there is, a huge amount of intellectual pressure that makes people fearful of saying no, and fearful of activism. We are very convinced that violence tends to beget more violence. So we feel that there's an activism that can be so healthy and so positive, and where we cultivate inner peace while we still say a very clear no. So activism and saying no doesn't have to be accompanied at all by anger. There's a certain type of anger which is, of course, certainly justified, but generally speaking, any anger, as we understand it, normally will eat away at us personally, and that's something that we want to avoid at all. And partly being connected to others in doing this prevents that type of anger and so resist and renew, and then finally celebrate. And that's this reminder every day of celebrating how much is still alive and the magic all around us. I mean, I often say, even just when we stop to contemplate on our thumb, how it can bend, and the magic of this simple, little part of our body, when we really are in touch with the richness of life, we really have so much to celebrate. And we also feel, as I said earlier, that celebration, as it was in so many indigenous and traditional cultures, accompanied by dance, song, and music, we can flood ourselves with that, and particularly now during the time of the virus. Let's do more of that. Let's celebrate those wonderful opportunities to enjoy, song, dance, and music together, to enjoy cooking our food, slowing down. We now have an opportunity, an imposition to start really getting in touch with what's really important, and the joys of every day and the joys of all life around us.
Thanks to our beloved elder Helena for reminding us that the systems we abide by are truly human constructs that we absolutely have the power to shift. You can learn more about her work at localfutures.org. Special thanks always to our sound engineer, Shannon Soul Carroll. You can find his music and learn more about his musical activism on Instagram at Shannon Soul Carroll. That's Carroll with 2 L's. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my partner in rhyme, Dave Rastovich, thank you for making the time to listen with us. We'll be continuing the conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. You can find every episode and some extras on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.